On the evening of June 4th, 1943, the residents of Mexia, Texas, a cotton town of roughly 6,000 people about 90 miles south of Dallas, lined Railroad Street to watch something that none of them had ever seen before and would never entirely forget. 1,850 men stepped down from railroad cars. They were tanned, broad-shouldered, physically imposing, the veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, elite soldiers who had been fighting across the desert for 2.5 years before surrendering in Tunisia 3 weeks earlier. They wore khaki desert uniforms, large-billed cloth caps, and the specific bearing of men who had been among the best soldiers in the world and who had not yet decided what they were going to do with that knowledge now that the war was finished for them. Their ranks stretched 3 miles down the Toacana Highway as they marched toward the newly constructed prisoner of war camp 4 miles west of town. A longtime Mexia resident who watched it described it for decades afterward. "We were a town of only 6,000 people," she said, "and we had just seen our population increased by 50%, and they were foreigners on top of it." Before this story goes any further, a quick reminder. While a lot of channels rely on unverified, fake, or exaggerated rumors, we don't play that game. We value your trust. Everything on this channel is strictly verified. Today's episode is sourced from Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America and the Humanities Texas Historical Archive. Full source list is in the description below. Now, let's go back to where this begins. The 1,850 men who marched down that highway had been told for years a specific set of things about America, that it was a mongrel nation, racially degenerate, weakened by its democracy and its racial mixing and its dependence on the labor of people whose inferior blood would eventually pull the whole structure down. That its resources were rich, but its will was poor, a country of soft businessmen and Hollywood actors, not soldiers. That its cities, if they still stood, stood only because Germany's war was being fought elsewhere, and the Americans had not yet felt what German military power actually looked like when it arrived at your doorstep. Every one of these ideas was going to be tested, not by a formal program, not by a carefully designed re-education curriculum, but by the specific and daily reality of America itself. The trains, the camps, the food, the farmers, and eventually the kitchen tables. This is the story of what those kitchen tables did to a decade of propaganda in the space of a single dinner. To understand what America did to the minds of these men, you first have to understand what those minds contained when they arrived. And that requires going back to Germany in the 1930s and to the specific and systematic work of one of the most effective propaganda operations in modern history. Joseph Goebbels, who ran Germany's Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda from 1933 until the end of the war, understood something about mass belief that most of his contemporaries did not fully appreciate. It is not enough to tell people what to think. You have to control the information environment they are thinking in. You have to make sure that contradicting evidence cannot reach them, that the experiences which would revise their beliefs do not occur, and that the few fragments of outside reality that do penetrate are pre-interpreted in ways that confirm rather than challenge the existing structure. For 10 years, from 1933 to 1943, Germany operated under exactly this kind of sealed information environment. The press was controlled, the radio was controlled, the schools were controlled, foreign travel was restricted and then essentially prohibited for ordinary citizens. The books that could be read, the films that could be watched, the music that could be heard, all of it was managed through a ministry that understood that the medium was the message, and that a person who had received only one kind of information across 10 years of adult life was a person whose understanding of reality had been shaped by that information in ways that were, by that point, genuinely structural rather than merely superficial. The specific content of what German soldiers had been told about America was detailed and consistent across a decade of exposure. America was racially compromised, a country that had allowed the contamination of its founding stock through immigration and through the presence of people the German propaganda classified as racially inferior. This racial contamination, the propaganda argued, produced a specific kind of national character, materialistic, undisciplined, incapable of the sustained sacrifice and collective will that the propaganda identified as the particular virtues of the German people. Americans were good at making money and good at making movies, and not much else. They were not, fundamentally, a military nation. Their soldiers, when they finally appeared on a battlefield, would discover what the gap between Hollywood bravado and actual combat looked like. The men of the Africa Corps were not, as a group, stupid men. They were not credulous peasants who had accepted every element of this propaganda without any private reservation. They were, in many cases, educated men who had been formed by their education in the specific way that any person is formed by the only intellectual environment they have known. The ideas about America that they carried were not, primarily, things they had consciously chosen to believe. They were things that had accumulated over years of the information environment doing what it was designed to do. What the propaganda could not account for, what no amount of sealed information management could entirely prevent, was the eventual encounter with America itself, the trains, the camps, the farms, and the kitchen tables. Those encounters were coming. The Africa Corps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. Roughly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers over the course of the campaign's final weeks, the largest surrender of Axis forces to that point in the war. The men were processed at the ports of Oran and Casablanca, loaded onto American cargo ships that were making the return Atlantic crossing after delivering war supplies, and transported across the ocean to the eastern seaboard of the United States. The ship crossing was the first departure from expectations. The German soldiers who had been told that America was exhausted, its resources depleted, its industrial capacity strained beyond what a mongrel nation could sustain, found themselves aboard vessels that were the product of exactly the kind of industrial capacity they had been told did not exist. The ships were functional, numerous, and continuous, not the desperate last-ditch effort of a nation running out, but the routine operations of a production system that was generating shipping at a scale that the German men aboard it found difficult to fit into what they had been told. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks. At the American coast, the prisoners were unloaded at ports in New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. And there, before they had even left the port facilities, the second departure from expectations occurred. New York was not damaged. The port was not damaged. The infrastructure of the largest city on the continent was functioning with an ordinariness that the men arriving from a Europe increasingly marked by Allied bombing and the specific material wear of a nation at war found disorienting. The propaganda had not told them that America would look bombed exactly. It had been fighting in the Pacific and North Africa, not Europe, and the absence of German bombs on American cities was technically consistent with what they had been told, but the specific quality of the intact American city, the scale of it, the density of it, the complete absence of the rationing-induced physical deterioration that had been marking German cities since the early years of the war, was something that no amount of theoretical consistency with propaganda claims could quite absorb. Then they boarded the trains. The trains across America were the third departure from expectations, and for many of the men who later described their journey to American camps, the most viscerally shocking. The transport coaches were upholstered, not the bare wooden benches of European prisoner transport, not the conditions of the overcrowded boxcars that moved troops and prisoners across the Eastern European theater, but padded seats in coaches that were, by the standards of any military prisoner transport these men had experience of, extravagant. Beyond the coaches, visible through the windows, was America itself. The specific geography of the journey, from the eastern seaboard westward and southward toward the camps in Texas and Kansas and throughout the American interior, was a continuous visual argument against everything these men had been told about the nation they were now crossing. The farmland that appeared as they moved away from the cities and into the interior was not the farmland of a nation running out. It was not the carefully rationed, partially fallow agricultural landscape of a country at war with its food supply exhausted. It was enormous. It was productive. It was, by the very fact of its visible extent and evident health, a direct material contradiction of the idea of American weakness and American exhaustion. One of the guards responsible for transporting the prisoners across the country described in a contemporary account the specific behavior of the men at the windows. They pressed against the glass, they pointed at things, they turned to each other and spoke in ways that the guard could not hear through the noise of the train, but that were clearly not casual commentary. They were processing something. The word that multiple accounts use looking back at this period is astonishment. The camps that the prisoners arrived at were, in terms of the conditions they provided, a further and sustained assault on the propagandist claims about American capacity and character. The United States had moved quickly after the fall of Tunisia, made clear that a very large number of prisoners was arriving. The War Department had converted CCC camps, the facilities built during the Depression-era Civilian Conservation Corps, along with high school gymnasiums, local fairgrounds, and racetracks into holding areas, while simultaneously constructing purpose-built facilities across the southern and southwestern states where the year-round climate was most manageable. By mid-1944, an average of 20,000 new prisoners were arriving per month. At the system's peak, 425,000 German and Italian prisoners were held in roughly 700 facilities across the country, the largest prisoner of war population in American history. The camps operated under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, and the United States had made a specific and consequential decision about compliance, strict adherence. Not because American officials were uniformly sympathetic to the prisoners, but because American officials understood the reciprocal logic of the convention's requirements. American prisoners were held in Germany. How Germany treated American prisoners was partly a function of how America treated German prisoners. Every prisoner in American camps who was treated well was a piece of evidence moving through channels that included the International Red Cross and the protecting powers that monitored both sides' compliance, that the American side was meeting its obligations, and that evidence created at least some pressure on Germany to meet its own. The food the prisoners received was the single most immediate and specific contradiction of what they had believed about America. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same food as the soldiers of the capturing power who guarded them. American Army food, which was specifically and systematically better than the Army food of almost every other combatant power, including Germany's as the war progressed, meant that the prisoners in American camps were eating more and better than most of them had eaten at any point in the preceding years of military service. Not luxuriously, not extravagantly, but adequately, reliably, and with a consistency that made the contrast with the food supply situation they had left behind them in Europe increasingly impossible to ignore. German POWs were paid 80 cents a day for the labor they performed, working on farms, in canneries, in forests, in construction, in the hundreds of occupational categories that the labor shortage created by the mobilization of American men had opened. 80 cents a day was the same rate that American privates received, and while the prisoners were paid in scrip rather than cash to limit their ability to accumulate resources for escape, the scrip was usable in camp canteens that stocked cigarettes, beer, and a range of consumer goods that again contrasted with what German soldiers had experienced during the war. There was a specific camp canteen detail that appeared in multiple post-war accounts as a particularly vivid illustration of what America looked like from inside. The prisoners were permitted to purchase Coca-Cola, not as a luxury item, not in limited supply, but as an ordinary, routinely available consumer product that could be bought with canteen scrip on any given day. To men from a nation where civilian consumer goods had been progressively restricted and rationed since the late 1930s, the unremarked availability of a soft drink was not a small thing. It was the specific texture of American material abundance made visible in a single aluminum can. If the specific and daily reality of what the camps themselves told these men about the countries whose propaganda they had been living inside, the food, the wages, the consumer goods, the working conditions, is the kind of history this channel exists to document, subscribe now. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who want them, because the camps were the context, the kitchen tables were the revelation. From the summer of 1943 onward, the logistical situation of American agriculture created a specific and unplanned encounter between German prisoners and American civilian life that no one in the War Department had anticipated in quite the form it took. The same mobilization that had created the labor shortage that the prisoner program was designed to address had not only removed men from factories and offices, it had removed men from farms. Rural America was working with a labor force that was, in many areas, dramatically reduced from its pre-war levels, and the agricultural calendar did not accommodate that reduction with any flexibility. Cotton had to be picked when it was ready. Corn had to be harvested in its season. Peas and apples and sugarcane had deadlines that the war did not extend. The prisoner labor program moved men in large numbers to exactly those places where the labor was needed: the cotton fields of Texas and Alabama, the orchards and canneries of the Pacific Northwest, the wheat and hay farms of Kansas, the cranberry bogs of Massachusetts, the lumber operations of the Pacific Northwest. By 1944, prisoner labor had become a central component of American agricultural production, so central that some regions would have been unable to bring in the harvest without it. The work put prisoners alongside American farmers in daily, sustained, physically shared labor. The German men picking cotton in a Texas field were working next to American farmers who were working the same rows. The men stacking hay in Kansas were working in the same heat as the farmer who owned the land. Physical labor in shared conditions produces a specific kind of social proximity, not friendship, not equality, but the particular baseline of common human recognition that comes from being side by side in difficulty. American farmers as a group were not natural ideologues. They were practical people whose relationship with the prisoners was shaped primarily by the practical reality that the prisoners were doing work the farms needed done. Most of them had no training in the management of enemy prisoners and no particular political framework for understanding the men working their fields. What they had was the long cultivated farmer's habit of assessing character by behavior, watching how a man worked, whether he was reliable, whether he did what he was supposed to do, whether his word was good, and making judgments on that basis. The prisoners, for their part, were working, doing actual physical agricultural labor in the American sun and the American wind on American land surrounded by the American countryside that the train windows had already shown them was not what they had been told. The work kept them occupied. The company of American farmers, even the relatively limited company of a shared workday, gave them a specific human reference point for what Americans were actually like rather than what the propaganda had said they were. In Kansas, as documented in the Smithsonian Magazine's account of the prisoner camps, some farmers invited their POW workers for meals, allowed them to go hunting or pony riding unattended, continued relationships even after the war. The specific details of how these relationships developed are not, in most cases, preserved in the official record. They happened in the informal spaces between the formal structures of the prisoner program, in the kitchen and the barn and the field, and they were not the kind of thing that appeared in the War Department's administrative documentation. But they happened, and what they produced in the minds of the men who experienced them was something that the formal re-education program, the expensive, carefully designed curriculum that the War Department eventually developed, never fully managed to produce. The regulations governing the prisoner program were explicit about fraternization. Prisoners were to be treated humanely and in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They were not to be mistreated or abused. They were also not to be invited into private homes, to share family meals, to participate in family activities, or to develop the kind of personal relationships with American civilians that would blur the line between prisoner and civilian that the program's security requirements depended on. The regulations were widely violated. Not maliciously, not through any organized resistance to the program's requirements. They were violated the way rules are always violated when the human reality they are trying to manage is more complicated than the rules anticipate. Through the ordinary human responses of the people they were supposed to govern, acting on what seemed right in the specific situation they were in, rather than on the abstract requirement of a document written by people who were not in that situation. A farm wife who had been working alongside German prisoners for 3 weeks, who had watched them work steadily and reliably and with none of the threatening behavior that she might have feared before they arrived, who was cooking a noon dinner for the family anyway, and who was standing in her kitchen looking at a group of men who were hungry and who had been in her fields since morning, that farm wife made a decision. She invited them in. What happened at those kitchen tables is not, in most cases, recorded in any document that has been studied by historians or preserved in any archive. The farm wife probably did not write it up. The prisoners may or may not have described it later, and if they did, those descriptions were mostly lost to the ordinary impermanence of informal conversation. What we have is the aggregate testimony, the pattern visible across hundreds of accounts of the prisoner program, from Arnold Cromer's exhaustive archival research to the individual stories preserved in local histories and the post-war memoirs of the men themselves. The pattern was this: the prisoners ate at the table. They were served the same food as the family. They sat in the same chairs. They looked at the same kitchen. They watched the farmer's wife move between the stove and the table and the sink, watched the children come in and sit down, watched the ordinary American domestic routine of a midday farm dinner proceed around them as if they were simply guests rather than prisoners. And everything about that experience, not the food specifically, not the kindness specifically, not any single element of it, but the totality of it, was a direct and sustained contradiction of every specific claim that a decade of German propaganda had made about this country and its people. The propaganda had said Americans were weak. The people at the table were not weak. The propaganda had said American society was decadent and chaotic. The farm kitchen was orderly and functional. The propaganda had said that Americans were motivated purely by material self-interest. The people feeding them were motivated by something that did not fit neatly into any available ideological category. A combination of ordinary decency, practical neighborliness, and the habit of treating the person in front of you as a person rather than a category. This last thing was the one that the propaganda had been least equipped to address, because it was the one that the propaganda's entire logic depended on not being true. The German ideology had been built, from its earliest foundations, on the proposition that people could be reliably divided into categories, racial, national, ideological, and that those categories determined character, capacity, and value in ways that the individual person in front of you confirmed rather than complicated. The kitchen table said something different. The individual person in front of you was not confirming the category. She was handing you a second helping of mashed potatoes and asking if you wanted more corn. The War Department understood in a general way that keeping 425,000 German prisoners occupied and manageable for the duration of the war was a problem that required more than adequate food and adequate facilities. An idle, resentful prisoner population was a security and administrative problem that no amount of physical infrastructure could fully manage. And there was, underneath the practical calculation, a question about what these men would do with what they had experienced when they went home. The formal re-education program that emerged from this awareness was called the Special Projects Division, and it began operating in October 1944, roughly 18 months after the first large cohort of Afrika Korps prisoners arrived. The program was designed around an interpretation of the Geneva Convention's Article 17, which encouraged intellectual diversions at prisoner camps. The Special Projects Division chose a small number of anti-Nazi prisoners with strong democratic convictions and set them to work creating newspapers, films, and educational materials that could be distributed to the broader prisoner population. The flagship product was a German-language newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. The name was chosen because American authorities hoped it would serve as a call inspiring prisoners to rethink their prior attitudes and embrace American ideals. Der Ruf was written by German prisoners, edited by German prisoners, and read by German prisoners, in a process that was designed to carry more credibility with its audience than anything produced by Americans telling Germans what to believe. The operation was headquartered at a series of secret camps in Rhode Island, at Forts Kearny, Getty, and Wetherill, where 85 German writers, artists, and professors worked on producing the intellectual content of the re-education program. The recreational activities at Fort Kearny included visiting the beach at Narragansett Bay, reading, writing, and discussing politics and culture. The men producing the re-education materials for 425,000 prisoners were, in a certain sense, experiencing a different America from the farm labor camps, the America of the university and the coastal resort, the America that showed its best face most deliberately. The formal program produced mixed results, and the historical assessment of its effectiveness is genuinely divided. One detailed study of the letters and documents produced by prisoners who went through the program found that out of 80 papers examined, only one was pro-regime, suggesting at minimum that the program was associated with a shift in expressed ideology. The Camp Concordia program achieved 88% participation in its summer 1945 re-education activities. Der Ruf eventually attracted an intellectual talent that would go on to shape post-war German literature. The paper was one of the precursors to Group 47, the literary movement that produced some of the most significant German writers of the post-war decades. But the historians who have studied the formal program most carefully, Ron Robin in The Barbed Wire College, Arnold Cromer in Nazi Prisoners of War in America, tend to a consistent conclusion. The formal re-education program was less effective than what had been happening informally for the 18 months before it began. The curriculum, carefully designed by liberal arts professors brought in by the Pentagon, stressed only the positive aspects of American society. It censored books and films that showed class divisions, racial problems, and wartime heroics, an approach that produced material that the prisoners recognized as one-sided in the same way they recognized official German material as one-sided, and treated accordingly. What the formal program could not replicate was the kitchen table. The kitchen table did not show only the positive aspects of American society. The kitchen table showed American society, with all its contradictions and complications and specific human realness in the specific domestic space where those contradictions and complications were most visible and most human. And that realness, precisely because it was not managed, was precisely what the propaganda had no defense against. If the distinction between the formal and the informal, between the program that tried to persuade and the kitchen table that simply was, is the kind of history that changes how you think about how ideas actually change, subscribe now. That is the whole reason this channel exists. Because the final chapters of this story, what happened when the prisoners went home and what they found there, is where everything comes together. Across hundreds of testimonies from former German prisoners held in America, testimonies collected by Arnold Kramer's research, by local historians, by journalists who interviewed former POWs in the post-war decades when the men could finally speak without constraint, certain specific moments of recognition appear again and again with enough consistency to constitute a pattern. The Aliceville camp testimony is one. A German soldier who arrived at Camp Aliceville in Alabama on a train described, decades later, watching with apprehension as a large number of American townspeople gathered on the platform to see the prisoners arrive. He said the prisoners were concerned because they did not know how this large group of Americans would respond to them. Then he watched as the people left the platform and went into the train station and came back out carrying coffee and sandwiches and other things for the prisoners to eat. He was telling this story 40 years later. He was still, after 40 years, sitting with the specific quality of that moment. The moment when the thing the townspeople did was the exact opposite of every preparation he had made for what they might do. The food shock appears in almost every account, and it is worth dwelling on specifically because the food shock was not primarily about the quality of what was served. It was about the quantity and the consistency and the unremarkable availability of it. The fact that food in America was simply there, in the amounts required, without the rationing and the substitutions and the progressive deterioration that had characterized food supply in Germany since the beginning of the war. A prisoner who ate his camp meal and then worked on a Kansas farm and was invited to a farm dinner and ate again, that prisoner had experienced in a single day more food abundance than a German civilian would have experienced in weeks. The arithmetic of this was not lost on the men doing it. The consumer goods shock was similar. The ordinary American supermarket, when prisoners were occasionally able to observe one, through a store window, during a supervised work assignment, in the town near a camp, was not a sight that fit any available category from their experience. The propaganda had allowed that Americans were materially prosperous. It had not prepared for the specific, overwhelming, democratic availability of that prosperity. The fact that ordinary people, factory workers and farmers and shopkeepers, had access to goods that in Germany would have been associated with the upper middle class, and that this access was unremarked, ordinary, simply part of what American daily life was. The racial complexity shock was perhaps the most philosophically specific. The propaganda had built the racial degeneration narrative around the presence of Black Americans and Jewish Americans in American society. It had used this as evidence of the fundamental weakness and confusion of the American national project. The prisoners arrived in a country that was simultaneously more racially unequal than anything they had expected, and more complexly human than any racial category had prepared them for. The Black American soldiers who sometimes guarded German prisoners, a situation that produced specific and documented reactions in many prisoners, whose training had not prepared them for the experience of being in a position of dependence relative to people the propaganda had categorized as inferior, were a specific and sustained challenge to the ideological architecture that the propaganda had constructed. It did not collapse overnight. 10 years of an information environment does not dissolve in 3 weeks of farm labor or 3 months of camp life, but the cracks, once started, did not close. Let's pause here and take stock of the full picture, because the story of German POWs in America is not a simple story of transformation. It has a darker layer that the simpler version leaves out, and leaving it out would be dishonest about what 425,000 men in 700 camps actually contained. Approximately 8 to 10% of the German prisoner population, by the War Department's own internal assessment, were committed ideological adherents who remained genuinely committed to German ideology throughout their captivity. They were in many cases the most vocal and demanding element of the prisoner population. They were the most organized, and because the War Department had made early decisions about prisoner management that left the internal hierarchy of most camps in the hands of the prisoners themselves, following the Geneva Convention's provisions that prisoner NCOs and officers should be permitted to maintain their authority over subordinate prisoners, the hardliners in many camps were the people running the internal administration. The consequences of this were documented and serious. At least 107 German prisoners were murdered by fellow prisoners during the course of the American prisoner program, killed in camps across the country for the crime of cooperation with American authorities, expressed sympathy for democratic ideas, or simply behavior that the camp's internal security apparatus identified as insufficiently committed to the original ideology. The trials that followed, secret military tribunals, many of them, produced convictions, but the specific dynamic that had allowed the murders to occur in the first place was never fully resolved. Der Ruf, the re-education newspaper, was burned by hardliners in some camps when it arrived. Prisoners who participated in the educational programs too visibly were watched by the ideological enforcement structure that the hardliners maintained. The social pressure within the camps to maintain solidarity with the German cause and with the German hierarchy was not abstract. It was backed by the specific and credible threat that men who departed too visibly from the expected position could face consequences. This is the part of the story that the War Department never fully understood and that the formal re-education program never adequately addressed. The program was designed to reach individual minds. The minds it was trying to reach were not operating as isolated individuals. They were operating inside social structures, the military hierarchy, the ideological enforcement networks, the specific peer pressure of 3,000 men who had been through the same war together, that shaped what any individual prisoner could express, could acknowledge, and could allow himself to believe. The kitchen table was different from the re-education program in this respect as well. The kitchen table happened to one man at a time, or to 3 or 4 men, not to the whole camp at once. The social structure of the camp was not present at the kitchen table. There was no peer enforcement, no ideological hierarchy to report to, no consequence for what the man sitting across from a Kansas farm wife allowed himself to notice. He was alone with the evidence, and the evidence was making its own argument without anyone to tell him he was wrong for noticing it. The repatriation of German prisoners from American camps began in 1945 after the German surrender and was completed, in large part, by the end of 1946. The process was orderly. The camps were closed. The men were transported back to Europe, processed through discharge facilities, and returned to whatever Germany had become. What Germany had become was, in most cases, catastrophically worse than the men who had spent the war in Kansas or Texas had been aware of. The information management that had characterized the German wartime information environment had kept the full scope of what the war was producing in Germany itself: the bombing damage, the displacement, the food scarcity, the specific and catastrophic human costs of the Eastern Front, and the steadily more visible evidence of what had been done in the camps, whose existence the propaganda had kept at the edge of official acknowledgement, from the prisoners in America as effectively as it had kept it from the German civilian population. The men who came home to a bombed German city, to rubble and cold and food scarcity, brought with them a specific and comparative knowledge that the German civilians around them did not have. They had been in America for 2 or 3 years. They knew what American food looked like, what American cities looked like, what the undamaged infrastructure of a functioning modern democracy looked like. They knew from direct daily experience the scale of what they had been fighting against, not in the abstract terms that strategic planners use when they talk about industrial capacity and national resources, but in the specific human terms of the farm dinner and the full grocery store shelf and the upholstered train seat. Many of them did not talk about it immediately. Germany in 1946 was not an environment where returning POWs who spoke well of America were received with enthusiasm. The political situation was complicated. The immediate human priority was survival, and the specific experience of having been treated well by the enemy was not something that fit cleanly into the narrative that either the Western occupied zones or the Soviet zone wanted to construct about the post-war period. But over the following years, as the Federal Republic of Germany began to build itself, and the immediate survival crisis eased, and the process of making sense of what had happened became possible, the specific knowledge that the returned American prisoners carried became relevant in a way that was difficult to quantify. Some of them came back. Thousands of former German POWs eventually emigrated to the United States, men who had spent 3 years in Kansas or Alabama and who, when the opportunity presented itself, chose to return to the country where they had been prisoners. Arnold Cromer's research documented case after case of men who kept in contact with the farm families they had worked for, who attended reunions with former American guards and townspeople, who built American lives. The most interesting number in the historical record of the German prisoner program is not the 425,000 held, or the 700 camps, or the 8 to 10% who remained committed hardliners. It is the thousands who came back. The men who had been taken from their homes at gunpoint, transported across an ocean, imprisoned on the other side of the world, and then returned voluntarily. That number is the measure of what the kitchen table actually did. Think about the arithmetic of what happened. Goebbels had 10 years. He had the press and the radio and the schools and the cinema. He had the ability to prevent contradicting information from reaching the minds he was managing, to pre-interpret any fragment of outside reality that leaked through, to construct and maintain an information environment so complete that the beliefs it produced felt not like beliefs, but like simply the way things were. He had 10 years. And then 425,000 men rode in upholstered train coaches across a country that was not supposed to exist, looked out the window at farmland that was not supposed to be that healthy, ate food that was not supposed to be that available, and sat down at kitchen tables where farm wives who were not supposed to be that ordinary handed them more mashed potatoes. It did not work instantly. It did not work on everyone. The 8 to 10% who remained committed throughout, the men who burned copies of their roof and organized the internal camp enforcement system, were proof that 10 years of an information environment leaves marks that 3 years of a farm dinner cannot always reach. The murder problem was real. The social pressure within the camps was real. But the thousands who came back were also real. The men who spent decades maintaining contact with the families they had worked for, who attended reunions and wrote letters and eventually moved back to Kansas or Alabama or Texas to start over. Those men were carrying something that Goebbels had not been able to prevent and that the formal re-education program had not been able to produce. They were carrying the specific, irreducible, first-hand knowledge of what America was actually like. Not the propaganda's America, not the re-education program's carefully curated America, the real one, the one that handed you coffee and sandwiches when you arrived on a train platform in Alabama looking worried, the one that sat you down at the kitchen table and gave you a second helping and treated you like someone whose hunger was worth addressing, regardless of whose side you had been on. That is not a program. That is not a policy. That is what happens when the sealed information environment finally meets the kitchen table. The kitchen table won. If you believe that this quiet, domestic, utterly unremarkable story deserves its place in the history of the Second World War, alongside the campaigns and the battles and the bombardments, subscribe. That is the whole reason this channel exists. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because the further this story travels, the more the farm wives who broke the regulations and invited the prisoners inside are properly remembered for what they actually did.